and welcome to our webinar. Today's topic, Phase 1 of the ISO 20022 Preparation for Fedwire Funds Service, FAIM 4.0.1 Scope. I'm Meredith Elmore with the Center for Learning and Innovation at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and I'll be your facilitator. Let me introduce our speakers today. Gina Russo and Leslie Lee are both in the Wholesale Product Office at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and are leading the ISO 20022 implementation for the Fedwire Funds Service. Before turning the call over to Gina, I do want to cover a few logistics. If you haven't joined us through the webinar yet, click the link you received after registering. For the best webinar experience, use the Frequently Asked Questions document, which can be found using the Materials button in the bottom left-hand corner of your webinar player page. And I do want to highlight a few important notes. You can listen to the audio through your PC speakers or through the phone. If you use the phone option, slides are not going to sync with your audio unless you change your settings. You can do this by selecting the gray gear located in the upper right-hand corner of your slide window just above the presentation. From there, you should see a few options in the media chooser. Make sure you select that phone option. You can also expand the size of the slides. To do this, there is a Maximize button in the upper right-hand corner right next to that gear button. If you'd like a PDF version of today's presentation, it was sent to you prior to today's call, but you can also access it through the Materials feature. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation, but you can submit them at any time during our call. If you have joined us via the webinar, just click the Ask Question button. We'll get your questions queued up for our presenters today. And now it is my pleasure to turn the call over to Gina.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Gina Russo at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. I will be kicking off the presentation and providing a brief overview of the overall implementation timeline for the ISO 20022 project. So if you look at the slide, the focus of today's presentation is just going to be on the ISO preparation phase, and we also refer to this phase as the FAIM 4.0.1, and FAIM stands for the Fedwire Application Interface Manual, and this is really our message format document that we use for the Fedwire Funds Service. So the focus again will be on the scope of what's included in this release. Our target implementation date for this release is November 23rd of 2020. And we're aligning this date with the SWIFT Standards 2020 release. So our changes will become effective at the same time as the SWIFT MT changes. And then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rest of this slide, but just for your information, we are showing the timeline for the other phases of the ISO project. So we have our ISO like-for-like phase, which is when we're going to be supporting both the legacy format and the ISO format during a transition period. And we will be transitioning customers over to ISO in waves. And this will be an 18-month beginning in first quarter of 2022. Then once all of our customers have been migrated to ISO, we will have a stability period where everyone is sending and receiving in the ISO format. And then once we are comfortable that no one needs to fall back to the legacy format, we will be sunsetting our legacy format, and we will be implementing ISO messages that include optional enhancements. And so we're hoping to finish the entire ISO 20022 project by the end of 2023. At the bottom of this slide, we include a link to a press release that we did on this timeline in October. Now, if you wanted to get a little bit more detail about the overall project, you can refer to slide 25 in this slide deck. We include a resource page where we include a link to our public website where you can see lots of different information about the project and the implementation approach, the timeline, frequently asked questions, and other information. And you can see any webinars that we've done on this topic, including today's webinar, which will eventually be posted there. But you can go and find a webinar that we did late last year on the overall implementation approach, and that will give you more details about what's included in each of these phases. So moving on to the next slide. So before we start going through all of the changes in this release, we just wanted to give you a little overview of the rationale for why we're doing this release. So you may wonder, you know, we're moving to ISO, why are we making all these changes to our legacy format? Well, the reason is because in order to move to the ISO format, there are changes that we need to make to simplify and clean up our legacy format because it will make the migration to ISO much easier, especially because we're supporting this migration, this 18-month phase 2, where we're only supporting the like-for-like version of the ISO messages, and cleaning up the legacy format is going to make it a lot easier for us to map the legacy format to the ISO messages during that 18-month window. We also want to align our current format with the existing SwiftMT messages. So while we are largely compatible with the current SwiftMT format, we have become a bit out of sync over the years, and this release will allow us to become better aligned with the MT format, which again will make it much easier to migrate to ISO. We're going to accommodate some changes that Swift is making to its format in November 2020, which is why, as I mentioned at the beginning, our implementation date of November 23rd of 2020 coincides with the Swift release for that year. And then we're also aligning to some best practices that were outlined by the High Value Payments Plus group. This is a group of market infrastructures around the world as well as global banks, and we came together and we developed some best practices for adopting ISO messages. But to accommodate some of those best practices once we get to ISO, it made sense to try to clean up our legacy format to implement them sooner. Again, making it much easier to migrate to ISO. And then finally, in this legacy release, we're also going to make some changes for the Treasury to support straight-through processing of IRS tax payments. So moving on to the next slide. So now we're going to walk through step-by-step all of the changes included in the release. And really, you know, once you really start looking, like your technical folks especially, once they start looking at our FAIM document, which we will be publishing, we actually published a version of it in November, but since then we've made some additional changes and we're going to be publishing another version of it, the FAIM 4.0.1 version. That will be published by March 30th, by the end of this week. And so really what you really kind of need to do is you kind of need to have the FAIM document open up, and you could go through our slide deck as you go through the changes in the FAIM. So what we've just tried to do here in this presentation is just summarize all of the changes, but it'll make more sense, I think, once you're also looking at the FAIM document. So on this first slide here, so in terms of changes related to the format version, we're going to be eliminating something called interface data, and this is a piece of information at the very beginning of the message, and we're going to be eliminating that. We're going to be changing the maximum message length to reflect what the maximum will be now that we're moving to FAIM 4.0.1. It changes slightly. We're going to be changing the format version that you include in the message. It'll be, instead of 3.0, which is the current version, it'll go to 4.0. And that format version appears in tags 1100 and 1500, so you'll see that change there. So moving on to the next slide. So these are changes related to the tag 1130, which is the error tag. So within this tag, in element 3, which is the error description, currently the description is limited to only 35 characters, And often, because of this limitation, the description is very cryptic, and often, it's hard to really understand what it means. So we are expanding this to allow up to 256 characters. And that way we will be providing, excuse me, we will be providing a longer description. And because we're doing this, so when we reject a message and we add tag 1130 to the message, you will have a long description. It'll be more user-friendly. And because of this, we will no longer need to support the error code description request and the response that you get back. You won't really need to go to a second step to look up what an error code means. You'll have the full description in the actual error message that gets attached to the reject notification. We're also going to be allowing both upper and lowercase characters in the description, because right now everything is uppercase. But since we have to change all the error messages anyway, and when we go to ISO, we will be supporting both upper and lowercase characters, we're going to do that now in the error code description. So moving to the next slide. So on tag 1500, which is the Fedwire sender supplied information, there is a URC element. It's the user request correlation data element. And so within the payment message, the acknowledgement, and the reject notification, we're going to be eliminating this piece of data, the URC. You will no longer have this. You'll no longer need to supply this information, and it won't be provided by us in the acknowledgement or the reject notification. However, well, that's the only change we're making. And again, it is related to eventually us migrating to ISO, but you really won't need this anymore. And really, if you need something that is a unique identifier for each message, you really have the IMAD. You don't really need this URC. And many banks today just fill it with spaces just to meet the edit requirement. So again, we're eliminating it in those three things: the payment message, the acknowledgement, and the reject. But it will be preserved in everything else where it appears. So the last two bullets on the slide, we're going to retain it in any inquiry messages and associated responses. It'll also be retained but populated with spaces in broadcast messages and in the subsidiary statement. So no changes there. The change is really restricted to, as I mentioned, the payment message, acknowledgement, and reject notification. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Leslie Lee, and she's going to take us through the next few slides.
Thanks, Gina. So on the next slide, we're making some changes to tag 1510, type and subtype codes, as highlighted on this slide. To simplify the conversion during phase 2, we will eliminate type code 10 in BTR messages and type code 16 in CTR messages. Today, we allow any combinations, but once we move into phase 2, we'll need to be more strict with the type codes that can be used with certain business function codes to help with the translation and mapping. We will also eliminate subtype codes 07 and 08, eliminating the current versus prior day concept. So participants would simply use subtype 01 for any return requests and subtype 02 for any returns. Moving on to the next slide. So as part of the cleanup, we will be also eliminating the business function codes listed here. The first 4 are eliminated due to low usage. The CKS, check same-day settlement, DEP, deposit to sender's account, FFR, Fed funds returned, FFS, Fed funds sold. The DRB and DRC business function codes will be replaced with a new business function code, DRR, for drawdown requests and refusals. During Phase 2, we will be implementing one ISO 20022 message to request a drawdown, so we are making this change to accommodate the new process. We are also eliminating business function code CTP, as this will no longer be needed. Instead, for cover payments, participants will use a BTR with a COVS code in the local instrument code element. And for all other customer transfer messages, the CTR business function code should be used. We have included a nice chart that provides a valid combinations of business function codes and type and subtype codes in Appendix A at the back of the stack. Moving on to the next slide. For tag 3500, previous message identifier, we made a change to only allow this tag when the message needs to be referenced to the original message. So it will be required for any return requests, returns, and drawdown refusals. We provided the business function code and the associated subtype codes for each of these messages. However, it will be optional for a service message, any messages with a SVC business function code and subtype 90. And for all other messages, tag 3500 will not be permitted. Moving on to the next slide. With Phase 1, we will make tag 3620, the payment notification, optional for all message types. We have also eliminated element 07, end-to-end ID, as we are providing additional references for messages, which I'll go into in the next slide. We also clarified how the payment notification indicator can be used to support market practices. Moving on to the next slide. So there are 3 different reference tags on the slide that can be used with various message types. It also outlines where certain tags are required or optional. You'll notice tag 3320 was renamed from Fedwire sender reference to instruction identification. This tag is optional in all of the message types. We also added a new tag, 3630, unique end-to-end transaction reference, also known as UETR. This tag is used to carry the UETR for those participants that have joined Swift GPI service, as well as for our Fedwire Funds Service participants to use as another end-to-end reference. And the last column is for tag 4320, which we also have renamed to end-to-end ID. We will be increasing the character length from 16 to 35 characters, as noted at the bottom. Moving on to the next slide. On this slide, most of the FI to FI information fields that exist today will no longer be used due to low usage and to also simplify the conversion during Phase 2. So all the 6100 through 6420 will be eliminated. For those participants who use these tags today can use tag 6500 going forward, which allows for 6 lines of 35 characters each for a total of 210 characters. Okay, well, I will turn it back to Gina.
Okay, thanks, Leslie. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, 14. So on this slide, we're summarizing all the changes we're making to the different party fields that are included in the message. So at the beginning, we're eliminating the short name data element in tags 3100 and 3400. Today, the short name is optional, and we're just going to be eliminating it in this release. We are also adding a new tag, 4210. It's the beneficiary option AF, and it's going to be in CTR messages and drawdown messages. And we're adding this to mimic the equivalent field in SWIFT, which is the field 59, options A and F. And this change really is being driven by the changes that SWIFT is making in November of 2020. Now, currently, SWIFT is also considering additional changes related to this tag, as well as our existing tag 5010. So if SWIFT decides to make additional changes to the comparable fields in the SWIFT format, there's a chance that we may have to change what we're doing in the November 2020 release. But for now, we're going to move forward as planned and as we've documented in the current FAIM version. And the decision about whether or not SWIFT will have additional changes, it'll be made in December of this year. So depending that decision, we may need to make additional changes to 4210 as well as 5010. If we do that, we will be sending out a communication to customers, and we will then, of course, have to update the FAIM document accordingly. So more to come on this. We also made significant changes to all of the fields listed here on the slide from tags 4000 through 5200. There's too many changes to really go over in this deck, so what we tried to do is summarize the key changes here at the bottom of the slide, but to really get a complete view of all of the changes to these fields, you really will have to refer to the FAIM document for complete details. But to summarize the key changes, one of the things that we did in all of these fields is we have the existing identifier element in these tags, so it's a field that exists today. We are replacing that by two new elements. So one is going to be called identifier BIC, and the other one is called identifier other. And as the name suggests, when you have a BIC as your identifier, you would be putting it in the identifier BIC field, and for any other identifier, you would be putting it in the identifier other field. Then we're also allowing an ID code T, which is an existing ID code, but it's only used for some of the fields. We're going to be allowing it in all of the fields, and it'll allow you to use a BIC with an account number. Then we're going to apply a stronger edit against the SWIFT BIC to say that the BIC must be 8 or 11 characters, because that's how it is in SWIFT. So we're going to apply, right now we edit for the proper structure of a BIC, but we don't necessarily edit for the length. So you're going to either have to put an 8-character BIC or an 11-character BIC. And then finally, we have a new ID code of N, and that's going to replace just what we have today as a space, so to indicate when there's no ID code. If you don't have an ID code today, you just leave it blank. But that can be confusing sometimes, so we just thought let's come up with a specific ID code just to make it clear that you don't have an identifier. So we came up with the N. So again, these bullets here represent the key changes we've made, but to really get into the specifics, you're going to need to refer to the FAIM document. Turning to the next slide, slide 15. So on this slide, we're summarizing the specific edits that we're going to do in the new tag 4210. We're going to be doing specific edits when it's a tax payment. So when the message is being sent to one of the two tax payment routing numbers, we're going to invoke this edit for this particular tag. And so in this tag, if you're sending to one of the tax payment receiver ABAs, You're going to have to put an ID code of 6 in the ID code element. If you're looking at the table, this table is showing at the far left, these are all of the individual data elements within tag 4210. So the first field is the ID code, and what we're saying here is that it must be a 6 when the 3400, which is the Fedwire receiver field, when that's one of the Treasury tax payment routing numbers, there's 2 of them, you're going to have to put an ID code of 6. Otherwise, you won't be able to use this ID code 6 for any other message. The identifier BIC, which is the next data element in this tag, that won't be permitted because that doesn't apply here. In the next element, the identifier other, this is really supposed to be for the tax identification number, and we're going to do an edit to make sure that it's 9 numeric characters. It can't contain spaces or alphas or special characters, and it also can't be all 9s or all 0s. So again, we're doing this edit to improve the straight-through processing of payments that are being sent to the Treasury for federal taxes. Then in the element 04, which is the name field, that's where you would put the taxpayer name, and we have an edit that says it has to be a 1 followed by a slash, and then at least 1 valid non-space character. The next one, so element 5, which is line 1, that will be for the tax type code, which will have to be a 1 followed by a slash, and then followed by 5 alphanumeric characters, but you can't use spaces or any special characters. The next data element is for the tax year. That'll have to be 1 followed by a slash and then 2 numeric characters representing the year. And then finally, the last data element would be for the tax month, and that will be a 1 followed by a slash, and then it'll be followed by either 00 if you don't know what the month is, or by a valid 2-digit month. And then at the bottom of this slide, we show an example of what it would look like in the actual raw Fedwire format.
Okay, turning to the next slide, we're going to talk about the changes related to the charges fields. So the first change is related to tag 3700, which is the charges tag. And we're going to make this tag required for all CTR messages, so it'll be required for all customer transfers. And we're going to be adding a new charge code for this tag. Currently, the only charge codes we support are the B for Ben and S for share. We're going to be adding the O charge code for the hour charge method. And this would be found in element 1, which is the detail of charges. So you would select either B, S, or O. In element 2, which is where you put the actual charges amount, you will have to include that field for the B charge code, the Ben charge code, but it will be optional for the S and the O charge codes. And we also noted in the FAIM document that market practices will really dictate when you're supposed to use the hour charge code. Currently, we have a market practice related to the SWIFT GPI service as well as Dodd-Frank. But really, you shouldn't be using the hour charge code unless you are doing it in accordance with the market practice. And then finally for this tag, we noted that because we're now making this tag mandatory, you will have to put something in element 01, which is the detail of charges field. So you're going to have to put a B, S, or an O in that field. And sometimes there may not be charges. So to indicate that there are no charges, you could also use an S, just to indicate that it's either share or no charges are present. Moving on to the next tag, so tag 3710, this is the instructed amount. And so this field is optional, but it will be required if there's any charges noted in tag 3700. So if you're actually using the second data element of tag 3700 to indicate that charges are present, then the instructed amount is probably something different than the actual amount that you're paying in tag 2000. So here is where you would indicate the actual instructed amount. So it was the original amount before the charges were assessed. So that would go into tag 3710. Then the next tag, tag 3720, this is also an optional field for the exchange rate, but it is required if your instructed amount includes a currency code that is not U.S. dollars. So if your instructed amount was really something in a foreign currency and you indicated that in 3710, then in 3720 is where you would put the exchange rate. So you really only use this when 3710 currency code is not USD. So moving on to the next slide.
So for remittance information, we are making some changes. So for customer transfers, we're eliminating the tag 8200, which is called unstructured addenda information. And this is the tag that we have today that's 9,000 characters, and it can support either free text or it can support other remittance formats. As an example, the STP 820 can be put into this field. And it's really not being used today. And we also want to align to the high-value payments plus market practice that says when you move to ISO 20022, you really should be, not allowing, lots and lots of free text for remittance information. Rather, you should be using structured remittance or related remittance. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to eliminate tag 8200 altogether, but we will be keeping tag 6000, which we have today. That's the originator to beneficiary information. That has 140 characters of free text for remittance information. So essentially that tag, the 6000, will become our unstructured remittance option. So instead of having this 8200 tag as our unstructured option, the unstructured option will really be what we have today in the 6000 field. Because we're getting rid of the 8200 tag, we also can eliminate the X12 and the MX character sets that were previously allowed for tag 8200. We no longer need to support those character sets. And then the next change is related to, so the three options that will be available for remittance information are the unstructured option that I already talked about, and that's the tag 6000, that's 140 characters. The related remittance option, that we have that today, that's 8250, that will remain just as we have it today. And then finally, the structured remittance, we have this today as well, represented in tags 8300 through 8750. We are making some changes, though, to the way the edits work for the structured remittance, and I'll go through those in a moment. The first change is we eliminated the specific tag 8650 for the related date, because this particular piece of information is actually a data element. We moved it as a separate data element within another tag, the 8400. And the reason we did this is really to align to how it works in ISO today. The date is really part of another field. It's not its own explicit field. So we wanted to make it match how it works in ISO. And then we also restructured data elements within certain tags to align with ISO. So we changed the order of how some of the data elements appear within the individual tags, again, to make the mapping much easier to ISO. And then the biggest change we made, though, is we changed the edits related to what can be repeated, versus non-repeated and how the 9,000 characters work, and I'll go through that in a moment. The last thing on this slide I'll mention is for bank transfers. We're not going to permit the 6,000 anymore in bank transfer messages, in BTR messages. And this is really to align with SWIFT, because SWIFT does not allow this comparable field in the SWIFT format. So you really will only be able to include remittance information within a customer transfer message. So if you turn to the next slide, slide 18. So here I'm going to go through how the edits work for the structured remittance. And so within this series of tags, the 8300 through 8750, it's structured tags where you can put remittance information, and you can repeat some of these tags, and you can have like multiple sets of remittance information, but you can only have a combined length of 9,000 characters for data. So the 9,000 characters does not include the tags or the delimiters. It's pure data. So within these tags and data elements, it's 9,000 characters of data. And within the structured remittance, all the tags are optional, but if you use it, you have to, at a minimum, use one of the tags, the 8450, the remitted amount. That is the only tag that is mandatory if you decide to use structured remittance information. So again, it's optional to use remittance information. You don't have to use it at all. But if you decide to use it, you must use at a minimum 8450. Another edit is that the structured remittance tags, they have to, within each set, they must be listed in ascending order. We're going to show you some examples of what it looks like. And then the next bullet is, so within a remittance set, again, you can have multiple remittance sets within the 9,000 characters, but for each set, there are certain tags that can only occur once, and they're listed here on slide 18. And then the next bullet are, these are the tags within each set that can actually occur more than once. So these three tags here can actually be repeated within each set. And if you turn to slide 19, it's probably easier to understand by referring to an example. So on slide 19, so we have two examples here. In the first example, we're showing a single funds transfer message that contains 3 sets of structured remittance data. So if you look at the table, each column represents a set of remittance data. And if you look across, you'll see that there's a common field within each set, and that field is the 8450, the remitted amount. Because again, as I mentioned earlier, the remitted amount is mandatory in every set. So at a minimum, you have to have the remitted amount for each set. All of the other tags are optional, but certain tags can only happen once. So if you look at the first set, so what it's really showing here, this is just every one of these tags happening once. But if you look at the second set, you can see some of the tags are happening more than once. So the discount applied amount, the 8550, you can see there's 2 of those, and there's 2 of the adjustment amount and reason. But there's actually only 1 of the invoicee and invoicer, because that can only happen once. And then in set 3, it's just showing a different example, but at a minimum, you must have the 8450, the remitted amount. Then if you look at the second example, so this example is showing if, a single funds transfer, you want to have 5 sets of remittance data. Each set, in this example, you have to have, again, the mandatory tag is the 8450 within each set. And here's where you just want to put a block of additional remittance information. you can, if you want to just, you would have to, put it, the 8750 allows for three lines of 140 characters each, I think. But you would have to repeat it in each set if you wanted to break up a block of remittance information and include that information into the additional remittance information field. You could do that, but you would have to break it up into 5 different sets in this example, and which means you would have to repeat the remitted amount. So turning to the next slide, I'm going to turn it back over to Leslie, and she's going to take us through some changes related to drawdown messages.
Thanks, Gina. So on this slide, we'll walk through the changes that we plan to make to the drawdown messages. So at the top, we have business function code, which we've already addressed. The DRB and DRC codes will be replaced by DRR for drawdown request and drawdown refusal. We're also making some changes to tag 6500. For drawdown refusal, a reason code must be provided, and we are providing some suggested reason codes in the FAIM document. And also for drawdown request and drawdown transfer, we will no longer allow tag 6500. So information that was previously included in this tag can now be included in tag 6000. In the originator tag 5000, originator will be replaced by 5010, the originator option AF. And in 5010, when you're using a DRR business function code, the ID code must be a T or a P with an account option. And you'll notice tag 4400, account debited in drawdown, will be eliminated because this information that was previously included will be replaced in tag 5010. In the beneficiary tag 4200 will be replaced by 4210, the beneficiary option AF. And in the 4210, with the DRR business function code, an ID code of T, D, or U must be used. We are also introducing new tags that will be permitted with drawdown messages. Tag 3620, the payment notification will be optional for all drawdown messages. And new tag 3630, the UETR reference tag, will be required for the DRW, but not optional for a DRR message. Tags no longer permitted for drawdown messages. It's probably too long to cover in this table, so we recommend that you refer to the FAIM 401 to make sure you see the tags that are no longer permitted. Moving on to the next slide. So this slide highlights the changes to cover payments. As we mentioned earlier, we renamed CTP COVS to BTR COVS to align with SWIFT MT202 COV messages. And in tag 3610, the local instrument code will now only be permitted for cover payments with the code of COVS. All other codes are eliminated, as noted in the slide. And we have also eliminated element 02 for proprietary code. Related to the cover payments, the 7000 tag series, we are making some minor changes to that. We're only permitting the 7000 tags for a BTR COVS messages. And we also made a correction in the element 01 for SWIFT field tag, as well as requiring element 02 for line 1. Moving on to the next slide. This slide provides an overview of changes to service messages. When we implement phase 1, all return requests should be done using the SVC business function code with subtype 01 and include a reason code in tag 6500. Again, we provided some suggested reason codes that can be used in the FAIM document. 4320, the end-to-end identification, will now be an optional tag in SVC subtype 01 messages. We have also made changes to eliminate the use of SVC business function code for drawdown requests. So specifically, the 1033, the 1633, and SVC messages. Going forward, to refuse a drawdown request, type subtypes 1033, 1633 should be used with a DRR messages. And for pure free text service messages, based on feedback from participants, we have increased the character length of tag 9000 to 1750 characters. That would be the SVC business function code with subtype 90. Moving on to the next slide. This slide highlights the changes to return payments. These are all payments with a subtype code of 02. Today, all possible fields are allowed to be present in a return message, but with the ISO 20022 implementation, returns will only be done by including a reference to the original message along with all parties involved with the return payment. Please note that parties should reflect their role in the return payment rather than in the original message. For example, originator from the original message becomes the beneficiary in the payment return. We are also requiring the use of a reason code with the return payment in tag 6500. Again, commonly used reason codes have been added to the FAIM document. We also note that we have removed several tags in a return payment, so we encourage you to refer to the FAIM 401 for complete details. And the next slide it's the Appendix A that shows our valid combinations of business function codes and subtype codes, the value messages and the non-value messages, the description, as well as the type-subtype combinations. And our last slide, again, Gina kicked off the presentation with this. This is our resources page where we have posted this. We launched it last year. It highlights not only our educational opportunities, the recordings, and all the software vendors that we're currently working with that interface with the Fedwire Funds Service and our frequently asked questions. It's a really good resource. If we encourage everyone to bookmark this as we will be updating it frequently. I'll put another note here that we will also be posting the My Standards onboarding webinar to this page in the coming weeks. That's the portal that we'll be posting all of the ISO 20022 format documents, including the FAIM 401. And I'll turn it back to Meredith.
Thank you, and I do just want to remind everyone to go ahead and get those questions in. There is that Ask Question feature located right there in your webinar. So if you want to go ahead and click on that, you can submit your question, and we'll get that submitted to our presenters. So I'm going to go ahead and kick off our question and answer portion with, does this pertain to everyone that uses Fedline Advantage, Fedline Command for Fedwires?
So first, I don't believe you can use Fedline Command for the Fedwire Funds Service. You can only use Fedline Direct or Fedline Advantage. And so yes, it applies to everyone. So all of our Fedwire customers are going to have to become familiar with these changes. But the degree of change that you need to make really depends on how much automation you have. So for Fedline Direct customers, because they have a computer-to-computer type interface to Fedwire, either they or their vendor has to make changes to be able to send and receive messages to Fedwire. For Fedline Advantage customers that are using the Fed Payments Manager funds application, so those of you that just manually key in your wires into the Fed Payments Manager, the only changes you don't really have to make any changes per se. You're just going to have to become familiar with the new look and feel of the screens and any of the new tags that appear on the screens, and realize anything that we've eliminated is no longer there. So you do need to become familiar with the changes, but it's more of a training exercise. And the Fed will be hosting future webinars for training for Fedline Advantage customers. So that will happen, really in 2020 as we're preparing for these changes. We will be having future webinars devoted to that. For the manual enter folks, it's more of a training and becoming familiar with the screens. However, we know that for the Fedline Advantage customers, many of you, thousands of you, are actually importing your messages from a back-end system into the Fedline Advantage Fed Payments Manager. So in a way, you're just like a Fedline Direct customer because you're creating a file of messages in a back-end system for upload into Fed Payments Manager. So you're going to have to make sure that that file format, whatever is creating that file for you to upload, that is going to have to be able to accommodate the new layout of the Fedwire Funds message. So for those of you, either you or your vendor is going to have to make the changes. Now, we have been working with software vendors. We know all of our Fedline Direct vendors. We've been working very close with them. Many of them are even on our format advisory group. And we've sent, several communications out to Fedline Advantage customers asking you, please tell us who your vendor is because we need to be able to work with them and we need to get this FAIM document to them and educate them about the changes. So what we've done to help with this effort, in addition to sending our direct communications, on the resources page that Leslie referred to, if you go to that link to our website, if you scroll down and towards the middle of the page, you'll see a list of all the software vendors that we're currently working with. And as we learn about new vendors, we will add them to this page because we realize that most of the change to accommodate this release, as well as our other phases of the project, the changes really need to be made by vendors who then roll them out to their clients. So we really need to make sure that we're working with the vendors. So again, if you have not responded to our communication about who is your vendor, please do so, and you could even submit that directly by going to our website. So I know that was a very long-winded answer, but I wanted to try to cover the answer for both Fedline Direct as well as Fedline Advantage customers.
Thank you very much. What will happen with the templates that we already have set up?
So unfortunately, because we're making so many changes, banks that are using the templates, and the templates is a feature within the Fed Payments Manager for Fedline Advantage customers, you will have to recreate the templates. We were making too many changes for to make the changes for you. You're going to have to recreate them. And what we're doing is for banks that are using lots of templates, because some of them have many, some have even hundreds of templates out there, we're going to be contacting them directly because we suspect that many of the templates are not really used, and it could be an opportunity to clean up the templates that you're using. So that's the long answer. The short answer is you have to recreate templates.
All Okay, thank you very much for that clarification. Will we be breaking anything if we start implementing these changes now?
So, I guess certain changes you could start doing now, like as an example, if you don't want to send any of those business function codes that we're getting rid of, nothing will happen. Now, it's possible that banks can still send them to you, but if you want to stop sending them now, you can certainly do that. If you want to stop sending all those 6,000 tags that we're getting rid of, you can start doing it. So I guess it depends on the nature of the change. Some of them you actually could start implementing now if you wanted to, but please note you have to be prepared to still receive the current FAIM version today. So kind of yes and no answer.
Okay, thank you for that. Is this going to be more core processor to know or change? We haven't heard of any of the legacy format and do not understand what we as users actually need to know about this.
So if I understand the question, so when you say core processor, it could mean you're using like a vendor maybe. You're putting all your transactions through a vendor's platform. We know that some vendors provide this service. So if that's the case, then yes, the vendor is going to have to make all the changes. But whatever kind of customer-facing application they give to you will probably look different. And if you have any automation to connecting to that application that you're doing yourself, you will have to make the changes. So I guess it really depends on what you're referring to, but essentially, like a short answer is if you do any automation to connect to Fedwire, if you're doing any kind of uploading or anything like that, you're going to have to make changes. If you're just typing something into a screen, then you probably don't need to make changes. You just need to know what the new screens look like.
Okay, thank you very much. So the FLA import-export function is not covered in detail in the FAIM. Will there be another document that describes the FLA import-export formats?
So the FLA, I know what you're saying. We don't explicitly cover it in the current FAIM, but basically the layout of the message is the same for both Fedline Direct and Fedline Advantage customers. So you will, today we do have a separate document because there are some differences for FLA versus FLD. If we create any, if we continue to have differences, we will have a separate appendix document that we would provide to anyone that needs it. But I think the hope is to try to keep it consistent. It's not really a great answer. I think we still have to figure that out if we're going to have anything different for Fedline Advantage customers.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there changes to the ISO 20022 in line with the SWIFT PIMPG market practices? How will Fedwire communicate any changes in the SWIFT PMPG or the ISO 20022 format changes?
So I think when you're referring to the SWIFT PMPG, which is the Payment Market Practices Group, you might be referring to the High Value Payments Plus group that I mentioned earlier, because that High Value Payments Plus group is really sponsored by the PMPG. And that was a group that came together of market infrastructures around the world as well as some global banks. And we came up with best practices for ISO 20022 messages. So for our ISO implementation, so really Phase 1, just to be clear, is really our legacy format. It's not ISO. It's our legacy proprietary format. It's not ISO. But when we go to ISO, we're going to be adopting the ISO messages that we came up with when we worked with the High Value Payments Plus group. So we're going to be aligning to those best practices, as much as possible. I'm not sure if offhand if we're 100% aligned, but I would say we're, probably 99% aligned with those high value plus market practices. And our intention is that as, if ISO over time, if they implement changes to the messages, that we would always stay in line with the latest ISO release. And we plan to, move to an annual release cycle, similar to how SWIFT does it today for the MT format. We would move to an annual release cycle. Once this is really post-2023, when we're on ISO, we would, if ISO makes changes, we will, be in lockstep making changes every year. I hope that answers your question. If not, please submit another one.
Yep, you can just submit that question right back the way you submitted your original. Okay, moving on to the next question. Do you know what additional changes that SWIFT is considering for the 59A and 59S?
Yes, there's two changes that are being considered. One change is to defer, it's deferring the elimination of the free text format for these fields, because right now field 50 and 59 in SWIFT, you can put, structured information or you can put free text. And one of the changes they want to make in November, the current plan change for November 2020 is to eliminate the free text option, and which is what we have done with our FAIM 4.0.1. But there are banks that maybe want to defer that change. So if that gets approved, we will basically add it back to our FAIM 4.0.1. The other changes, if we move forward with eliminating the free text change, which is what they're currently planning, there's another change for the 59A in SWIFT, the beneficiary field, of making the country code mandatory, because currently the country code is optional, and it would become mandatory in the 59A. So those are the two changes that are currently being considered with the, the banks can submit change requests to SWIFT, and then they're considered over the summer, and then they're finally voted by the SWIFT board in December. So we really won't know the answer until December. But whatever the answer is, we will adjust the FAIM document if necessary. It's possible that both will be rejected and we'll just stick to our current plan.
Okay, thank you very much. Will the DIT allow SWIFT test and training BICs and fields?
Well, so in our DIT environment, which is our depository institution test environment, will we allow SWIFT test and training BICs? I mean, we'll allow banks to put BICs in there, and we will be doing, let me say it this way. We are not going to be editing for valid BICs. We're going to edit for a valid structure of a BIC, making sure that I forget what the format is, but we will be editing for the proper format of the BIC, and we will be editing to make sure it's either 8 or 11 characters, but we will not be editing to make sure it's a valid BIC. So I don't even know that we would know if it was a SWIFT test and training BIC versus a live BIC. We'll just look to make sure that it's the proper format.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any UAT time frame, or we may use our own timelines using the Fed test environment?
So our current plan is to make the DIT available in February 2020 for the FAIM 4.0.1 release. Once we are sure about the date, we will be publishing that on our website, but our current tentative plan is February of 2020.
Okay, thank you. Is there a mapping document for X12 to structured remittance?
I'm not sure what you mean by this question. X12, isn't that a character set? Our FAIM document includes the character set that we allow today in Fedwire. So it's just the Fedwire character set. We were supporting the X12 and the MX character set as well for tag 8200, but since we're getting rid of that tag, we're also getting rid of those character sets. So those character sets were only allowed in the 8200 field. So I guess the answer is no, we're not going to be supporting the X12 character set because we're getting rid of the tag that it was allowed in.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So for the tag 3700, when there are no changes, should we still send a 3700S or 3700 SUS D000?
Okay, I can see this question on the screen. So this is about when you don't have any charges and you're using the SHA, the share charge code of S, you do not need to include charges. So it's the first thing, the 3700 with just the S. You only need to include charges if you're using the BEN or the O. Wait, no, I'm wrong. The BEN, the B. You only need to put the charges for if you have the charge code of B. When the charge code is S or O, you don't have to put any dollar amount for the charges.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. So can I still use an invalid BIC with a B identifier, or is the Fed going to edit it?
So as I mentioned earlier, we're not, in this FAIM 4.0.1 release, we are not going to we're not going to check for a valid BIC. We're only checking for a valid format. Now I will note that when we implement ISO Phase 3, our enhancements release in 2023, we are looking into whether or not we will actually start validating or doing a check for a valid BIC. We may introduce that as an enhancement, but we haven't officially decided that yet. We are looking into that though. So for now, we're only going to be checking for a valid format of a BIC.
All right, thank you. Will the 7,000 field tags have mapping edits corresponding to the ISO 20022 fields, or if the original payment was ISO?
So I think you're talking about what we're doing in Phase 2. So in Phase 2, we're going to be converting banks over in waves to start sending and receiving ISO. And when a bank cuts over to ISO, they can still be sending to banks that haven't cut over yet. So the Fed, we're going to map that. We'll map an ISO message into a legacy format. So the Fed will do that mapping. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but to me it sounded like you were more asking about when we get to Phase 2.
Okay, thank you for that. And if our asker has some clarification on that, just feel free to send that back over and we can pass that along to our presenters as well. So moving right along, is the beneficiary or originator country code mandatory for either part of Phase 1 or when the ISO 20022 goes live?
So in Phase 1, the country code is mandatory for the originator if you use country and town. If you use this line code of a 3, which means it's a country and town, we're going to be looking for a valid ISO country code. But it's not that we're making the country code mandatory for every single message. It's just if you decide to put in the country and town, or if you decide to use that line code, we're going to make the country code mandatory. And when we move to ISO, it'll work similarly. Like if you choose to use the postal address component in ISO, you will have to put a country code in there. So it's more like it's only mandatory if you choose to use the postal code field, or the address field. On the beneficiary side, for Phase 1, the country code is not mandatory unless SWIFT makes this change that I was trying to explain before. Unless they make a decision to start making the country code mandatory for the beneficiary in a SWIFT message, if they start making it mandatory, then so will we. But for now, we're not making the country code mandatory on the beneficiary. However, when we go to ISO, we will be making it mandatory, again, if you use the address fields. I'm sure that was a very confusing answer, but if it's not clear, please resubmit.
Thank you. So my understanding is that there's a free format for the beneficiary field, which will be eliminated by November 2020. Did you imply that the free format option may be retained based on the decision, which will be made on December of 2018?
That's correct. So right now, we are planning to get rid of the free format option for the originator and the beneficiary in customer transfers. That is true. However, if SWIFT changes, their mind and decides to defer getting rid of that free format option in SWIFT, then so will we. We're going to have to add it back to the originator and beneficiary fields that can be used in a customer transfer. But as of right now, you'll see in the FAIM document that for customer transfers, you have to use the 5010 for the originator or the 4210 for the beneficiary, and within those two tags, you cannot just put a free format address.
Okay, thank you for that. So the Fed allows all kinds of invalid characters. Are there any plans to use the SWIFT character set?
So the Fed, they're valid characters for us. So, we allow, maybe what you're saying is that we allow characters that are not supported on the SWIFT network. For now, we are retaining the current Fedwire character set that we allow today.
Okay. So the new FAIM 4.0.1/ISO 20022 is based on XML or the JSON format?
So the FAIM 4.0.1 is our legacy format. It's not ISO, it's not XML, and I don't even know what JSON is, but it's our proprietary format. When we move to ISO 20022, that's XML.
Okay, thank you. So as a vendor, can you share some of your materials with your customers?
So I think you mean, can vendors take our documents and share them with your clients? The presentation deck that we're going through today is going to be on our public website, so you can certainly share that. Vendors sign an NDA with us that they're not supposed to be sharing our FAIM document unless they ask us. So vendors would need to reach out to us to see if you can share it with your customers, but your customers will get it through us. We'll be, we can make the document available to any Fedwire participant that requests access. However, what we're trying to do with the documents, because we're posting them on this SWIFT My Standards website and there's a process to get access to it, we want to, before we grant access, we want to make sure that we're only giving access to people that really need the documents. And the people that need the documents are really the programmers, the business analysts that need to work with the programmers to implement the changes. Those are really the folks that need the documents. Because they're very technical in nature. They're hard to even read unless you really have to do something with them. So it really doesn't make sense to send this, like for a vendor, to send the FAIM document to your customers and, wait till you get to the ISO usage guidelines. You're never going to want to send all those to your customers. It's really for technical people. But any kind of presentation decks, anything on our public website can be shared with anyone. And that's probably at the right level of detail for, just general folks. It's really the programmers that need the more technical documents.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So per our core provider, we need to complete the ISO 20022 Action Required Contact Information Form. Where can we find this form?
It sounds like Jack Henry, as a vendor, is asking you to fill out a form for them. That's what it sounds like. Now, what the Fed did, we sent a communication to all the Fedwire participants asking you to tell us who your vendor is. So that's what we want. We want to know who your vendor is. But Jack Henry, it sounds like maybe Jack Henry is asking you to fill out a form and send it to them, not to us.
Okay, thank you. Can you please provide a brief overview of how Phase 2 will be completed?
Sure. And again, we do have a webinar on this. We did it in, I want to say October or November of last year. It's on our website, October. And that goes into more details on each of the phases, but I'm happy to give you an overview here. So in Phase 2, now this is when we're really introducing ISO. And what we're going to be doing over the course of 18 months, we're going to be converting our customers in waves, meaning that, let's say a group of 10 customers, we're going to convert them to ISO on this one weekend. And then the following weekend, we're going to take the next group of customers and convert them. But as a customer, once you're converted to ISO, you're going to be converted to both sending and receiving ISO. But the ISO messages that you're sending and receiving are really going to be limited to what we allow in our legacy format today. And that's why we're calling them the ISO like-for-like messages, because it's not a fully enhanced ISO message. It's just limited to fields and character lengths that we allow today. And the reason for that restriction is because if, once we convert a bank to ISO, they're going to start sending everything in ISO, and they don't want to have to figure out, well, who can receive which format. So we, the Fed, will figure that out in the middle. So banks will start sending us ISO, and if they're sending to a receiver that's still on the legacy format, we will convert the ISO to legacy and deliver the legacy to the receiver. And likewise, for banks that are still on legacy, well, if they're sending to someone that's already converted to ISO, we will convert the legacy message into ISO. And so this conversion that we're doing, because we don't want to truncate any data, this is why we need to limit the ISO messages to just like the like-for-like version, the version that looks very similar to our legacy format. And so, again, we're going to use an 18-month period to convert all of our customers to sending and receiving ISO. At the end of this 18-month period, we're calling it a stability period, because we want to have a good solid 3 months where we feel confident that everyone is sending and receiving an ISO, no one's having any problems, no one needs to convert back to legacy. That's another benefit of this phased approach, is that as we convert a customer from legacy to ISO. If for some reason you start having problems and you need to convert back to legacy, we can do that and no one will know that you had any problems. It doesn't impact anyone else in the market. And so this gives, it really reduces a lot of risk for us as well as the banks. And that's why we need an 18-month period to do all this conversion. So in the stability period of the 3 months, we want to make sure that everyone is stable and nobody has to convert back, because once this stability period ends, we're going to sunset our legacy format. We won't be able to go back to legacy anymore. We will completely get rid of our legacy format. And at that point, that is when we will implement the enhancements. And when we say enhancements, it's things like additional parties that are not in the message today. As an example, the message today only allows for one intermediary bank. Well, in ISO, you can actually have up to 3 intermediary banks. So we will allow that when we implement the enhancements. But all the enhancements that we're implementing are going to be optional to send. So we're not forcing anyone to send these additional, pieces of information. However, everyone will need to be capable of receiving all of these enhanced fields. And we're going to be testing your ability to receive all of this before we convert you in Phase 2. So more to come on this. We're actually going to have another webinar in April, I think April 19th, where we go into much more detail on what's happening in Phase 2 and Phase 3. And then we're also having these in-person workshops. The first one is May 2nd here in New York. There's another one on May 23rd at the Fed in Chicago, and then one on June 5th at the Fed in San Francisco. And these are going to be full-day in-person workshops where we're going to talk about the whole project, and we're going to go into a lot more detail, particularly on what's happening in Phase 2 and Phase 3. We're going to show you what these usage guidelines look like, how the mapping is going to work, and what are these enhancements, and how is the testing going to work. So we really encourage, especially the people that actually have to implement all this, we really encourage you to come to these workshops. So all this information is available on our website. The link is on that resources page that Leslie mentioned at the end of our slide deck. And if you go to that page, when you scroll down, you'll see all the educational sessions with a link to register. So again, we have one more webinar, April 19th, where we talk about Phase 2 and 3. And then, as I mentioned, we have these 3 in-person sessions. So we encourage folks to come. And, this isn't the end. Throughout the next several years, we're going to be having probably many more webinars and workshops, and this is all we have planned so far, but this is a very big implementation, so we're going to have to make sure we have enough outreach to customers and vendors.
Okay, thank you, Gina. And I do know we have a few minutes left, so if you have those questions, go ahead and use that Ask Question feature located in that bottom corner of your webinar to get that question submitted. So we do use Fed Payments Manager funds and manually create wires. What will happen on Monday, November 23rd of 2020 when we log in? Are we going to be seeing new screens?
Yes, that's exactly what will happen. When you log in that morning, you're going to see new screens. They're probably going to look similar to the screens you have today, but the look and feel will be different. Anything that we deleted will no longer be there. Any of these new tags that we're adding, you'll start seeing them. Any templates that you previously created, you're going to have to create them again. And probably any messages that were in your outgoing messages folder that you didn't actually successfully verify or complete the Friday before, they're going to be purged probably. And all this information will be sent as we get closer to the implementation. So in 2020, we're going to be having dedicated training webinars for Fedline Advantage customers, and we're going to be showing you the new screens. In fact, we're actually coding them right now. We just saw a demo of them yesterday. So, you know, they look nice, actually. So we're in the middle of coding all of this right now as we speak.
Okay, thank you very much. So when will the specific ISO 20022 message types that correspond to the FAIM message type be available? For example, the 1000 CTR will translate or use an ISO 20022 PAX 008.001.5 ISO message type.
All the mapping documents.
The mapping documents. Okay. So this is really referring to Phase 2, and we do have a set of mapping documents that we're going to be posting on our website on Friday, right? On Friday. On Friday, on the My Standards website, again, this is the SWIFT My Standards website. This is where we're sharing all of the documentation for all 3 phases. So on Friday, we're going to publish the FAIM 4.0.1, which looks very much, it's a PDF document. The look of it looks just like, you know, the FAIM document that you're used to seeing today. So that'll be easier to follow. But then for ISO, there's a whole bunch of things. So there's going to be Excel files that are mapping documents, which is really the crux of this question, to show you how legacy maps to ISO. We haven't done the mapping yet to show the reverse, though, of how ISO maps to legacy. We still have to do that. So right now the mapping document is only showing the one way, legacy to ISO. You're also going to see on My Standards all the individual usage guidelines for the ISO messages. We're implementing, like, I forget how many guidelines we have.
20
guidelines? 24 guidelines that's supporting both Phase 2 and Phase 3. So they're like individual documents.
Again, we would be reviewing all of this.
We're going to review all of this in our April 19th webinar, and we're going to walk through it in painstaking detail during our in-person workshops. And then the other thing that will be posted on My Standards on Friday is the ISO implementation guide, which is like a Word document, and it's, you know, it's hopefully in user-friendly wording to explain what the heck all of this is and explain, you know, what each ISO message is. We have lots of nice diagrams to explain the message flow. And that's really, you know, that implementation guide is really the thing you need to read before you start getting into the details. So all of this information is going to go out there on Friday, but we're actually not sending the letter to customers until next week. But for those of you who already have access, and all of the vendors, or most of the vendors already have access, you'll actually be able to see all this on Friday.
Okay, thank you very much. And I do know we are close to the end of our call, but I do want to check and see if Gina or Leslie, if either of you have any closing remarks.
I'll just add that, you know, we didn't address all of the questions that came through the webinar, so we will go through them and answer them offline as needed.
And I'll also add, any kind of frequent questions that we're getting, we update our FAQ document that's posted on our website.
Yep.
So if there's anything that came up today that we want to, you know, add to the FAQ, we will be doing that. So I guess in closing remarks, I would say, you know, step one is if you need access to these documents, you know, please let us know. We will grant you access. If you have not told us who your vendor is and your vendor is not listed on our webpage, please let us know. And please be checking that webpage on a routine basis, because that's where you're always going to find the latest information, including all of the recordings of the webinars will be posted there. Yeah. I was just going to say thank you, everyone, for your time and attention, and we appreciate the questions.
Well, I want to thank Gina and Leslie and everyone on the team that has made this program and everything for all of our participants so successful today. So thank you again for sharing your time and expertise with everyone today, and this ends today's call. Have a great day.